92? Something seems off here. And that's the thing about this, because when you look at it, 92% for a season 2, s- I'm not going to say it's out of the ordinary. It's definitely not out of the ordinary. Of course, there have been better season 2s and 3s and so on and so forth. But here, it's just a little bit weird because, well, the first season was 87%. The second season's 92%. Now, if the reviews weren't what they were, I think it would be way more believable. I think that we would look at this 92% and we would go, you know what? I can see it. Even with the 58% fan ratings, I could still see how the critics could be at 92%, assuming that all of the reviews matched up and everything kind of made sense from that regard. But they don't match up. And I think that's one of the weirdest things about this. I mean, when you have a lot of people coming out, and a lot of them do say the same things. When you have a lot of things coming out and it says things like Lord of the Rings series, The Rings of Power is beautiful but empty in season 2. When you got things like Rings of Power season 2, getting better but still flawed. When you have things like Rings of Power season 2 review, not as bad as haters say, but still worse than it should be. It's like, well, wait a minute. What's going on here? How do we get here? Even the New York Times that came out, and they were actually pretty favorable to the first season. The Rings of Power season 2 premiere, all that glitters. The new season picks up roughly where season 1 left off, with most of the same strengths and flaws. And so you see stuff like that and you go, well, if there's that many people who are seemingly in agreement that, you know what, it's kind of empty, that, you know what, it's there, but it still has its flaws. It's more of the same, if you will. Then how does it get to 92? I don't know. That's weird to me. And it kind of speaks to a bigger issue that I think is the problem with Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, specifically on Amazon. We know what happened in season 1. We remember everything that happened. And if you don't remember what happened in season 1, a little bit of a refresher. Season 1 came out and it was downvoted like crazy when the trailer happened. And then when it did come out, people were just like, nope, not for me, don't like it. And a lot of people actually gave legitimate, for the most part, criticism. Yes, there were absolutely racist and sexist and all that stuff like that. All of that absolutely existed, but that was a way smaller of a segment, way smaller of a grouping than the media wanted you to believe. In fact, there were a lot of people who were like, hey, this is not Tolkien at all. And honestly, I don't blame them, because all of the marketing, everything that had led up to it was talking about the fact that, hey, we're going to follow the books. This is going to be an expansion. This is going to be an extension of Tolkien, if you will. And that didn't happen. And so obviously, it makes sense why people will go, well, you didn't do anything that's Tolkien like at all. In fact, some of the main characters that you have don't match up at all. I get that. From a marketing perspective, if you are told one thing and then somebody gives you a completely different thing, we like to call that a bait and switch. Of course, you're going to be like, nah, I'm not with it. I'm not with it. But the thing that really hurt it was that all of those reviews, everything from the really, really bad ones that talked about things that had nothing to do with the show, to the ones that were critical, but actually legitimately critical, everything got ushered in together. And so when IMDb, which Amazon owns, by the way, when they started getting the reviews, they started deleting stuff, because if it didn't fit with what they wanted the show to feel like or be like or get reviewed in a certain type of way, they just would let it go. Most people who had a review actually lost them if they were 1 star. But if you had a 10 star, you were all good. And that exposed the bigger problem, because it kind of showcased that, man, Amazon was willing to do whatever it took in order to make sure that this series would be successful. And of course, they would be willing to do whatever it took to make it successful, because why wouldn't you? You spent hundreds of millions of dollars, not on just the property itself, but on the marketing. It's Jeff Bezos's biggest project. He wanted it to be the flagship show, not Reacher, not The Boys. He wanted this, Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, to be the flagship show. And they put all this effort, all this energy into the visuals and making sure that it looked the part, without realizing that the visuals don't actually need to matter. You don't need to make something that is that grandiose. In fact, you could make the case that they could have done just as well with something that was a little bit dingy, that did feel like it came out of the mud, as long as there was a good story. And I think that's the problem here. You start wondering what is actually going on here? Because if you're going to have a situation where all of a sudden all the reviewers are basically giving out scores just because, then how do you actually know what the series is supposed to bring? How does that bring anything back? How does it bring anybody back? Right? Like that's the thing I don't understand with the marketing for this series. It's never made much sense to me. On one hand, you have JD Payne and Patrick McKay who talk about themselves being major, huge super fans of Tolkien, talking about how they're going to stick to the lore, how they're going to stick to the script and make sure that it actually praises what came before. And then the show comes out and it does none of that for the most part. In fact, it's so much different that you could consider it fan fiction in certain cases. And so that kind of marketing confuses people because wait a minute, this was supposed to be something that was an extension, that was supposed to be even better, that was supposed to really bring the series forward. But that's not what actually happens. One of the things I don't understand with JD Payne and Patrick McKay is just what they were actually trying to do when it came to the marketing of this series. I mean, at one point it was, well, we're big fans, super fans, if you will, and we're going to stick to the lore and stick to the script and make sure that Tolkien's work is on screen and for everybody to see. And it's going to not deviate that far from it. And then the series comes out and it does just the opposite. It deviates completely to the other side to the point where, in some instances, you could effectively call it fan fiction. And so now it's like, all right, well, that marketing didn't work because you essentially lied about what you were going to do in order to try and bring in that core fan base. And instead of connecting with them, you have now disconnected with them. Now that they are actually complaining about that disconnect, saying, hey, this doesn't make any sense. Why are you doing this? You decide to go on and call them patently evil and things like that. And you decide to group everybody together and say, hey, this is racist. This is sexist. These are these kinds of things that are out there. And it's like, well, why can't somebody just be critical if it's not good? If it doesn't follow the things that you claimed they were going to follow, right? Because when you deviate from what you actually promised, then it becomes an extremely easy project to just disregard. And no over reliance on visuals or crazy type of battles or big sequences are going to help bring those people back. That's just not going to happen because that story direction is still going to matter in the first place. Because if you deviate from that, it's extremely hard to just bring people back just because some scene is cool. Because let's be honest, you can go on YouTube and just look at a cool scene of any type of show or movie that you want and call it a day. You don't actually have to take in the time to actually watch the entire episode or movie that went along with it. Why would you? Especially if you don't actually like what's being put on screen, right? You can accept that something's cool and say, you know what, man, that was actually pretty cool. That was a cool part of this. And then be like, but I'm not watching that. I don't need to see anything else that's a part of that. Why would you? Now, I'll admit that season one trailer actually caught me off guard. I was actually quite impressed with it. I thought it was actually really good. But I've been fooled by trailers before. And so after a certain amount of times, you start to go, I need to know a little bit more. Like, are you actually going to address season one's criticisms? Are you actually going to talk about the lack of story direction and seeing where that actually goes? Are you actually going to try and connect with the fan base again? Is that actually going to happen? Or is it going to be more of the same? And so far, it looks like it's going to be more of the same based off the reviews that have come out, which makes this 92% a little interesting. Now, I'm not saying that it shouldn't happen, that it shouldn't get high remarks. If it's good, it's good. That's fair. But 92% kind of makes it seem like there's some kind of play here where, yeah, it's okay and that's fine. We're just cool with it being okay. And I don't think that's a good thing because if you're willing to basically reward mediocrity or reward satisfactory, then how does anything better come out of this? That being said, it is possible that the show actually ends up doing a little bit better than it did last season. But if it's just incrementally, if it's not anything that really moves the needle forward, then I have a real hard time seeing how this is going to go past the season three. Because at this point, you are going to have a situation where you have an extremely expensive series that has so much tied to it. But nobody's watching because they are so burned by what happened in the first season, as well as what's happening with the behind the scenes with people kind of going at fans and the back and forth and everybody's calling each other something. That's not going to help this series. And Amazon, who spent so much money trying to make this into the biggest thing they possibly can, trying to beat Game of Thrones and make it so that The Witcher never even seemed like it existed on Netflix, they're going to find themselves in a bit of a rut. And if they can't be honest with themselves when it comes to season 2 to the point where they're willing to put a little bit of pressure on everybody else just to make sure that you give it good remarks, then the same thing will happen for season 3, except everybody will know exactly how you operate. And that can't be good for the show.